"You don't marry a man like that unless you have no other choice," Charlotte Hayes said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet murmurs of the room. And the lawyer across the polished oak table didn't argue, didn't even blink, because everyone in that Manhattan office already knew the truth she refused to say out loud, that this marriage wasn't about love or hope or even second chances. It was about survival, and survival rarely looked graceful. The contract sat between them, thick, precise, every clause measured like it had been written by someone who understood both power and restraint. And as Charlotte's fingers hovered above the final page, the city outside stretched endlessly, steel and glass reflecting a life she was about to lose piece by piece, because her father's empire was collapsing, quiet but certain, like a building whose foundation had already given way. And this marriage, this arrangement with a man she had never met, was the last thread holding everything together. "He's just a single dad," she added, almost to herself, as if saying it enough times might make it easier to accept. And the lawyer finally spoke, calm, measured. "Daniel Brooks has agreed to all terms." 3 words, simple, controlled, followed by 2 seconds of silence that felt heavier than they should, and then one truth that no one in that room understood yet. That agreement didn't mean weakness. The pen clicked softly in her hand, a small sound swallowed by the weight of the moment, and for a brief second, Charlotte hesitated, not because she believed in the man she was about to marry, but because something about the way his name had been spoken, steady, without negotiation, without urgency, felt wrong, like a note slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect song. "Does he even know who I am?" she asked, not looking up, and the lawyer's answer came without hesitation. "Yes," followed by a pause, just long enough to matter. And he didn't ask for anything in return, and that was the first crack, small, almost invisible, but real, because in her world, everyone asked for something. The signature came quickly after that, ink meeting paper in a single smooth motion, and just like that, the deal was done, the future sealed, and somewhere across the city, a man she had already decided to underestimate simply folded the signed copy, placed it neatly on a worn kitchen table, and went back to helping his daughter with her homework as if nothing had changed at all. The wedding was arranged in less than a week, quiet but expensive, the kind of event designed to look elegant while hiding desperation. And when Charlotte first saw Daniel Brooks standing at the end of the aisle, there was nothing remarkable about him at all. Average height, simple suit, no designer label in sight, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. And for a moment, just a moment, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. Not attraction, not fear, just stillness, like standing in a room where the air didn't move. "You're late," one of her friends whispered behind her, barely hiding a smirk. "Guess that's what happens when you marry for convenience." And a few quiet laughs followed, sharp, dismissive, easy, because judging him was effortless, because he looked like a man the world had already decided didn't matter. Daniel didn't react, didn't defend himself, didn't even shift his weight, and when their eyes finally met, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not as a greeting, not as submission, but as acknowledgement, like he understood something she didn't yet. And when the officiant began to speak, the words felt distant, ceremonial, fading into the background of something far more significant unfolding in silence. Because this wasn't the beginning of a love story. Not yet. It was the beginning of a test, one built on pride, assumption, and a truth waiting patiently beneath it all, a truth that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The house Daniel brought her to was not what Charlotte expected, and that unsettled her more than she cared to admit, because it was not broken, not neglected, not even modest in the way she had imagined. It was simply quiet, a 2-story home tucked into a tree-lined street just outside the city, with a clean driveway, trimmed hedges, and a front porch that held the kind of stillness money could not manufacture. "This is it?" she asked, her tone sharper than necessary, and Daniel nodded once, setting her suitcase down gently as if it mattered. "It is enough," he said, 3 simple words, steady, unbothered, followed by the soft creak of the front door opening and the faint sound of footsteps inside, and then one small voice that changed the air completely. "Dad?" A little girl appeared in the hallway, no older than 8, her hair loosely tied back, her eyes curious but calm. And when she saw Charlotte, she did not smile right away. She simply looked, as if she was trying to understand something deeper than introductions, and Daniel's expression softened in a way Charlotte had not seen before. "Emily, this is Charlotte," he said quietly, and the girl nodded, polite, composed. "Hello," she replied, her voice gentle but certain, and Charlotte forced a small smile in return. Unsure why that single word made her feel like she was the one being evaluated. The evening unfolded without ceremony. No grand gestures, no awkward speeches, just the quiet rhythm of a life already in motion. Daniel setting the table. Emily finishing her homework, the sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the background, and Charlotte standing in the middle of it all, out of place in her tailored coat and carefully measured expectations, because nothing here asked for her approval, nothing tried to impress her. It simply existed with a kind of quiet dignity she could not control. "You can take the upstairs room," Daniel said, his voice even, as he placed a plate in front of Emily. "It has the best light in the morning," and Charlotte raised an eyebrow slightly. "You are not even going to ask if I like it?" she said, a hint of challenge in her tone, and Daniel paused for just a second, not offended, not defensive, just thoughtful. "You will decide that on your own," he replied, calm, followed by the soft clink of silverware and the low hum of evening settling into the walls. And then one realization that landed quietly but firmly, that he was not trying to win her over. Dinner passed with minimal conversation, Emily asking simple questions about school, Daniel listening more than he spoke, and Charlotte observing, waiting for something to reveal itself, some flaw, some sign that this man was exactly who she believed him to be, ordinary, predictable, insignificant, but every time she thought she had found it, it slipped away, replaced by something else, something harder to define, like the way he noticed when Emily's glass was empty before she asked, or the way he folded a napkin with the same care someone else might give to a contract worth millions. Later that night, as Charlotte stood by the window of the upstairs room, looking out at the quiet street below, her phone buzzed with a message from one of her friends. "So how is life with your charity husband?" Followed by a laughing emoji, and she typed a response quickly, almost instinctively. Exactly what you would expect. 3 words, dismissive, controlled, followed by a long pause as she stared at the screen, and then one thought she did not send, one she did not fully understand yet, that nothing about Daniel Brooks felt like what she had expected at all. The invitation arrived 3 days later, thick ivory paper edged in gold, the kind that did not ask for attendance but expected it, and Charlotte held it between her fingers with a familiarity that felt like returning to a world she had never truly left, even as she stood in a home that did not measure worth in appearances. "The Hayes Foundation Gala," she said aloud, her voice carrying a note of something sharper now, something closer to control, and Daniel glanced up briefly from where he was helping Emily with a math problem, his tone even. "You should go." 3 simple words offered without hesitation, followed by the quiet scratch of pencil on paper and the soft ticking of the clock, and then one question Charlotte did not expect to ask. "You are coming with me, right?" Daniel paused, not surprised, not eager, just thoughtful, and Emily looked up between them, her small eyes moving from one face to the other, as if she already understood more than either of them said. "If you want me there," Daniel replied calmly, and Charlotte lifted her chin slightly. "It would look strange if you did not," she said, a statement disguised as necessity, and he nodded once, accepting the role without argument, without pride, as if presence was something he could offer without needing recognition. The night of the gala unfolded with the kind of polished precision Charlotte had been raised to navigate, the city skyline glowing beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, the low hum of conversation layered with soft music and the clink of crystal glasses. And as they stepped into the room together, the shift was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable, heads turning, whispers forming, eyes lingering just a second too long on the man beside her, because he did not belong to their expectations, not in his simple suit, not in the way he carried himself without performance. "Charlotte, you made it," a voice called out, bright, practiced, and a group of familiar faces approached, smiles wide but eyes calculating. "And this must be him," another added, glancing at Daniel with thinly veiled curiosity, and Charlotte felt it then. The weight of their judgment pressing in, waiting for her to define him before they did. "This is Daniel," she said, her tone controlled, careful, and one of the men chuckled lightly. "Ah, the mystery husband." 3 words, light on the surface, edged underneath, followed by a sip of champagne and a glance that lingered just long enough to be disrespectful, and Daniel did not react, did not shift, did not offer more than a polite nod. His silence steady, unbroken, like he had already decided what mattered and what did not. "So, Daniel," another voice joined in, sharper now, "what do you do?" And Charlotte felt the moment tighten. The question simple but loaded, designed to expose, to measure, to reduce, and Daniel answered without hesitation. "I take care of what is mine," calm, clear, not defensive, followed by a brief pause that stretched longer than expected, and then one quiet shift in the air, because no one knew how to respond to something that did not fit their script. A few polite smiles followed, a change of subject, the conversation drifting away as easily as it had formed, but the tone had already been set, the lines drawn, and Charlotte moved through the evening with practiced grace, greeting donors, exchanging pleasantries, all while feeling the presence beside her not as a burden, but as something else entirely, something grounded, unshaken by the noise around them. Later, as she stood near the balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin, she overheard it, soft but unmistakable. She really married down, followed by a quiet laugh, and before she could react, before she could decide whether to ignore it or correct it, Daniel stepped beside her, his voice low, steady. "It is a beautiful view." 3 simple words, redirecting, deflecting, followed by the distant glow of the city lights and the faint sound of traffic far below, and then one realization that settled in her chest with quiet force, that it heard everything, understood everything, and still chose not to let it define the moment. The drive home was quiet, but it was not the same silence Charlotte had grown used to, because this one felt heavier, layered with things unsaid, things she could not quite name, and as the city lights faded behind them and the road stretched into the dim glow of suburban street lamps, she found herself replaying the evening in fragments, the laughter, the looks, the subtle cuts wrapped in polite words, and the way Daniel had stood through it all, without shifting, without shrinking, without needing to prove anything at all. "You could have said something." She finally broke the silence, her voice controlled, but edged with something sharper underneath, and Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "About what?" he asked, simple, direct, and Charlotte exhaled slowly, as if the answer should have been obvious. "About them," she said, "about the way they spoke to you." 3 quick sentences, tight, measured, followed by the hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of tires against pavement, and then one response that landed quieter than she expected. "They spoke from what they understand," he said calmly. Charlotte turned toward him, her brows narrowing slightly. "And you are fine with that?" She pressed, and Daniel paused for a moment, not defensive, not dismissive, just thoughtful. "I do not need them to understand me," he replied, and the words did not rise, did not demand attention. They simply settled into the space between them with a kind of certainty that felt unshakable. The car slowed as they turned onto their street, the familiar outline of the house coming into view, porch light glowing softly against the night, and Charlotte felt something shift again, something subtle but undeniable, because for the first time, the quiet of that house did not feel like absence. It felt like choice. Inside, Emily was already asleep, a small lamp left on in the living room casting a warm, steady light across the space, and Daniel moved through it with quiet intention, setting his keys down, checking the door, adjusting a blanket that had slipped from the couch, as if these small acts carried weight beyond their size. And Charlotte watched from the doorway, her heels still on, her posture still held in the shape of the evening, but something in her expression loosening just slightly. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked suddenly, the question sharper now, more direct, and Daniel looked at her fully for the first time since they had left the Gala, his gaze steady, unreadable. Because it mattered to you, he said, and Charlotte blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. You did not even know me, she countered quickly, and he gave a small nod. I knew enough, he replied, 3 words, quiet, followed by a pause that stretched longer than comfort, and then one truth that felt almost too still to hold, that he had not entered this arrangement for gain, for status, or even for survival, but for something she had not yet learned to recognize. Charlotte stepped further into the room, her voice lowering slightly. Most people would have asked for something, she said, more to herself than to him, and Daniel's expression did not change. Most people measure value differently, he answered, and the clock ticked softly on the wall, the sound grounding, steady as the weight of that statement settled. She looked at him then, really looked, not at the suit, not at the surface, but at the way he stood, the way he did not fill the room yet somehow anchored it, and for the first time since she had signed that contract, Charlotte Hayes felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of her certainty. Not doubt, not fear, but the quiet beginning of a question she had not considered before, and it did not come with noise, it did not demand attention. It simply existed, patient, waiting to be understood. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a pale wash of sunlight slipping through the kitchen window and settling across the wooden table, and Charlotte found herself awake earlier than usual, standing barefoot on the cool floor, watching as Daniel moved quietly through the room like someone who had nothing to prove and nowhere to rush. His sleeves rolled, his focus steady as he poured coffee into 2 plain mugs without asking how she took it, and she noticed that one cup was already set slightly closer to where she stood, as if he had accounted for her presence without needing acknowledgement. You are up early, she said, her voice softer now, less guarded, and Daniel glanced at her briefly, offering a small nod. Mornings tend to be honest, he replied, 3 simple words, calm, followed by the faint sizzle of the pan and the distant sound of birds outside, and then one quiet shift in Charlotte's expression, because she did not know what that meant, but she felt it. Emily entered a moment later, her steps light, her eyes still carrying the softness of sleep, and she smiled when she saw Charlotte, not wide or exaggerated, just enough to matter. Good morning, she said, and Charlotte returned it, slower this time, less forced. Good morning, she echoed, and Daniel placed a plate in front of Emily, then another in front of Charlotte without ceremony. Eggs, toast, simple, warm, and Charlotte hesitated for a second before sitting down, as if accepting the plate meant accepting something more. You do not have to stay if you have plans, Daniel said after a moment, his tone neutral, not dismissive, not inviting, just open, and Charlotte looked at him, her brows lifting slightly. I did not say I had plans, she replied, and he nodded once. Then you do not, he said, and the conversation settled again into quiet, but this time it did not feel empty. Later that afternoon, Charlotte sat at the small desk in the living room, her laptop open, a series of financial reports spread across the screen, numbers bleeding into each other in ways that did not make sense, projections failing, patterns breaking, and she exhaled sharply, frustration rising as she tried to trace the source of the collapse that had led her to this point, and Daniel passed behind her without interrupting, carrying a stack of folded laundry. But he paused for just a second, his eyes flicking to the screen, not intruding, just noticing. Something is off, Charlotte muttered, more to herself than to him, and Daniel set the laundry down quietly, stepping closer but not too close. What are you looking at? He asked, his voice even, and she hesitated, then turned the screen slightly toward him. Quarterly projections, but the liquidity gap does not align with the reported assets, she said, her tone sharpening with focus, and Daniel studied the numbers for a brief moment, not long, not dramatic, just enough, and then he spoke. The timing is wrong. 3 words precise, followed by a short pause as Charlotte frowned. What do you mean? She asked, and he pointed lightly, not touching the screen. The outflow is being recorded late, but the impact is immediate, he explained calmly, and Charlotte blinked, her eyes moving quickly across the data again, recalculating, reordering, and then she saw it, the inconsistency she had missed, the gap that shifted everything. That is not possible, she said under her breath, and Daniel stepped back, already turning away. It is consistent, he replied, and the room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that followed realization, not confusion, and Charlotte stared at the screen, her heartbeat picking up slightly, not from panic, but from something sharper, something closer to clarity. Because he had seen in seconds what her entire team had overlooked for weeks, and he had said it without emphasis, without pride, without even staying to watch her reaction, and for the first time, the question forming in her mind was no longer quiet. It was undeniable because nothing about Daniel Brooks was aligning with the story she had chosen to believe. The realization did not leave Charlotte quietly. It followed her through the rest of the day like a question that refused to fade, and by the time evening settled in, she found herself watching Daniel more closely, not with suspicion, but with a kind of focused curiosity that felt unfamiliar, because she was no longer trying to confirm what she believed, she was trying to understand what she had missed. "Where did you learn that?" she asked as he stood at the counter, rinsing a glass with the same calm precision he seemed to apply to everything, and Daniel did not look up right away. "Learn what?" he replied, simple, unhurried, and Charlotte stepped closer, her voice firmer now. "The financial analysis, the timing issue, that is not something people just notice." 3 quick sentences, edged with insistence, followed by the soft rush of water and the faint hum of the refrigerator, and then one answer that landed softer than she expected. "I pay attention," he said. Charlotte exhaled, a hint of frustration breaking through. "That is not an answer," she pressed, and Daniel turned off the faucet, drying his hands slowly before meeting her gaze. "It is enough of one," he replied calmly, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to evade, just a quiet certainty that he did not owe her more than he chose to give. Emily's laughter drifted in from the living room, light and unguarded as she watched something on television, and the sound cut through the tension just enough to shift it, to remind Charlotte that this house operated on a rhythm she did not control, a rhythm that did not bend to pressure or expectation. "You knew it would help me," Charlotte said after a moment, her voice lower now, more measured, and Daniel gave a small nod. "Yes," he answered, one word, direct, followed by a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, and then one truth that settled deeper than she anticipated, that he had chosen to help without asking for credit, without even staying to explain. She studied him then, her eyes tracing the detail she had ignored before, the way he stood without tension, the way his movements were deliberate but never rushed, the way he seemed to exist just outside the need to impress anyone, and it unsettled her in a way that felt less like discomfort and more like recognition. "Most people would have made a point of it," she said quietly, and Daniel leaned back against the counter slightly, his expression unchanged. "Most people need to be seen doing the right thing," he replied, and the words carried no judgment, only observation, and Charlotte felt them settle somewhere deeper than she expected. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her, the sharp vibration cutting into the quiet, and she turned to glance at the screen, a message from her father's advisor flashing urgently. "We need to talk immediately. The numbers are worse than expected," followed by another message seconds later. "There is a meeting tomorrow. You need to be there," and Charlotte's jaw tightened slightly as she read, the weight of everything she had been trying to hold together, pressing back in all at once. "I have to go into the city tomorrow," she said, her voice returning to its familiar control, and Daniel nodded once. "All right," he replied. No questions, no conditions, just acceptance, and Charlotte hesitated for a brief moment, something unspoken rising before she pushed it down. "It might take all day," she added, and he gave the same steady nod. "Emily and I will be here," he said, and the simplicity of it struck her again, because he did not ask what she needed. He simply ensured she did not have to worry about what he could handle. Later that night, as Charlotte sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the report still open on her laptop, the corrected numbers now forming a clearer but more troubling picture, she found her thoughts returning not to the crisis ahead, but to the man who had quietly shifted her understanding of it in a matter of seconds. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether he was hiding something, but why someone with that kind of clarity would choose to remain unseen at all. The next day began with movement, sharp and deliberate, the kind that carried urgency beneath its surface, and Charlotte stepped back into the world she understood with practiced precision, heels clicking against marble floors, glass doors opening into conference rooms filled with familiar faces and unfamiliar tension. Because this time, the numbers were not just projections, they were fractures, and every person in that room felt it, even if they refused to say it out loud. "We are running out of time," one executive said, his voice tight, controlled, and another added quickly, "The liquidity gap is widening faster than we anticipated." Three quick statements, overlapping, pressing, followed by the low hum of screens lighting up with charts and figures that told a story no one wanted to accept, and then one quiet truth sitting beneath it all, that the system they trusted was already failing. Charlotte stood at the head of the table, her posture steady, her expression composed, but inside, something had shifted because for the first time, she was not looking at the problem the same way. She was looking at it through a lens that had been handed to her without explanation, without credit, and it changed everything. "The timing is wrong," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, and the room stilled slightly, attention narrowing. "The outflow is being recorded late, but the impact is immediate," she continued, repeating the insight that had come to her not from months of analysis, but from a single quiet observation in a quiet room. And the effect was immediate, confusion giving way to recalculation, screens updating, eyes widening as the data realigned. "That changes the exposure entirely," someone muttered, and another leaned forward. "If that is true, then the source is not where we thought it was," and Charlotte felt the shift ripple outward, controlled but undeniable, because for the first time since the crisis began, they were not reacting, they were understanding. The meeting stretched for hours, numbers breaking, reforming, strategies shifting in real time, and Charlotte held her ground, guiding, correcting, pushing where needed, but every decision, every conclusion, carried the quiet echo of something she had not created, and she felt it, not as a weakness, but as a reminder. Later that afternoon, as the room slowly emptied, one of the senior advisors approached her, his expression measured but curious. "That insight this morning, where did it come from?" he asked, and Charlotte paused for just a second. The question simple, direct, and she could have answered it easily, could have claimed it, could have folded it into her own authority without consequence. But something in her resisted, something quieter, steadier. "It was pointed out to me," she said instead, her voice calm, and the advisor nodded slowly, studying her for a moment before speaking again. Whoever it was, they saw what the rest of us missed. 3 words of acknowledgement, followed by a slight shake of his head, and then one realization that settled deeper than she expected, that she had not just borrowed an idea, she had revealed a gap in the room. When Charlotte finally stepped outside, the city felt different, louder, faster, but also less certain. And as she stood on the sidewalk, her phone in her hand, she hesitated before dialing, a pause that stretched longer than necessary, because for the first time, she was not calling out of obligation or expectation, but because she wanted to understand something she could no longer ignore. The line rang once, then twice, and then his voice came through, steady as always, "Hello," and Charlotte exhaled softly, her tone quieter now, less guarded. "The numbers shifted today," she said, and Daniel did not respond immediately, just listened. We're looking in the wrong place," she added, and there was a brief silence on the other end, not empty, but attentive, and then one simple question that carried more weight than it should have. "What will you do now?" he asked, and Charlotte looked out at the city, the movement, the noise, the uncertainty, and for the first time, her answer did not come from habit or expectation. It came from something steadier, something she was only beginning to understand. "I will follow what is true," she said, and the words felt different as she spoke them, not loud, not dramatic, just clear. And on the other end of the line, Daniel did not praise her, did not question her. He simply said, "Then you will be fine." And the certainty in his voice did not sound like reassurance. It sounded like knowledge. The change did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly over the next few days, in small moments that did not ask for attention but refused to be ignored. And Charlotte found herself noticing things she had once dismissed. The way Daniel's phone would ring, and he would step outside without urgency, speaking in low tones that carried no strain. The way he read through documents not as if he was learning, but as if he was remembering. And the way people, strangers she did not recognize, would occasionally greet him with a respect that felt out of place for the man she thought she knew. "Do you know them?" she asked one afternoon as they walked past a small cafe, and a man in a tailored suit nodded at Daniel with quiet acknowledgement, and Daniel glanced back briefly. "We have crossed paths," he said, 3 simple words, unembellished, followed by the soft hum of traffic and the distant sound of passing bus. And then one detail Charlotte could not ignore, that the man had not just nodded, he had paused, as if waiting for permission to do more. Later that evening, as Charlotte reviewed updated reports at the dining table, her eyes caught a name buried deep within a network of corporate holdings, a name she had seen before, not once, but many times, always at the center of decisions that shaped entire markets. And her breath slowed slightly as she traced the connections, the ownership layers, the quiet consolidations that did not appear in headlines but moved billions beneath the surface. And then she saw it, not directly, not in bold letters, but in a pattern so precise it could not be accidental. "This does not make sense," she murmured, her voice lower now. And Daniel, standing nearby with a cup of coffee, did not ask what she meant. He simply waited, and Charlotte turned the screen toward him, her finger resting lightly against the data. "This structure, it is designed to remain invisible," she said, and Daniel's eyes moved across the information for a brief moment before he looked back at her, calm, steady. "It is designed to protect stability," he replied, and the words did not explain everything, but they explained enough. Charlotte leaned back slowly, her mind racing not with confusion, but with clarity that felt too large to ignore. "Who builds something like this?" she asked, not expecting an answer. And Daniel took a small sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with quiet care. "Someone who understands consequences," he said, and the room fell still around them. The kind of stillness that comes when a truth is close but not yet spoken. The following day brought another invitation, this one unexpected, a private meeting requested by a consortium Charlotte knew well, a group that did not meet without reason. And as she arrived at the location, a high-floor office overlooking the city, she felt the familiar tension of power moving beneath the surface, controlled, deliberate. And as she stepped into the room, the conversation paused, not dramatically, but noticeably, as several figures turned toward her with expressions that held something new, something measured. "Miss Hayes," one of them greeted, his tone respectful but cautious. "We have been expecting you." 3 words, formal, followed by a brief silence that stretched longer than protocol required, and then one moment that shifted everything, as another man, older, composed, stepped forward slightly and glanced past her shoulder, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. "We were not aware he would be joining you," he said, and Charlotte turned instinctively, her breath catching just slightly as she saw Daniel standing just inside the doorway. Not announced, not introduced, simply present. Daniel did not step forward immediately. He did not claim attention. He did not correct the room. He simply met their gaze with the same quiet steadiness he had always carried. And one by one, the men who controlled industries, who shaped decisions that affected millions, adjusted their stance, their tone, their certainty, not in fear, not in submission, but in recognition. And Charlotte felt it then, not as a shock, but as a realization that had been building all along, because the room did not grow louder, it did not erupt, it did not demand explanation. It simply fell into silence. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have something to say, but because the room had already said everything without words. And Charlotte stood there, still, her eyes moving slowly from one face to another, watching the shift unfold in real time as men who had built empires recalibrated their posture, their tone, their understanding, not toward her, but toward the man who had entered without announcement, and yet carried the weight of recognition like something they had been expecting all along. "Mr. Brooks," the older man said finally, his voice lower now, measured in a way that had not been there before, and Daniel inclined his head slightly. Not in submission, not in pride, just acknowledgement. "You have been quiet," another added, a faint attempt at composure threading through his words, and Daniel stepped forward just enough to close the distance, his presence steady, unforced. "Quiet does not mean absent," he replied. 3 simple words, calm, followed by the soft hum of the city beyond the glass walls and the faint shift of chairs as the room adjusted around him. And then one truth that settled deeper than any introduction could have, that it never needed to announce who he was. Charlotte felt it then. Not as shock, but as clarity finally catching up to reality. Every small detail aligning. Every unanswered question finding its place. The patterns, the insight, the restraint. All of it forming a picture she could no longer deny. And yet what struck her most was not the scale of what he was, but the quiet way he had carried it without ever using it to define the space around him. "We were reviewing the current exposure," the older man continued, regaining some control, and Daniel gave a small nod, his gaze moving briefly to the data displayed across the screen. "The structure is holding, but only because it was designed to," he said, and the room leaned in slightly, not out of obligation, but because they understood now that his words did not come from speculation. They came from authorship. Charlotte's breath slowed as she listened, her focus no longer divided, because this was not a revelation meant to impress. It was a confirmation of something that had been present all along, hidden not by deception, but by choice. The discussion moved forward, controlled, precise, decisions made with a clarity that had been missing before, and Charlotte found herself no longer leading alone, but standing beside someone who did not need the room to follow him for it to align, and that shift did not diminish her. It steadied her. When the meeting finally concluded, there were no grand gestures, no applause, just quiet nods, measured acknowledgments, and one by one, the men who had once questioned, once underestimated, stepped forward with a different kind of respect. Not loud, not performative, just real. Charlotte waited until the room had cleared, until the glass doors closed softly behind a last departure, and then she turned to him, the space between them no longer filled with assumption.